Well, thanks for joining us today. We have the pleasure to be with Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy, and we are going to answer the question, does God exist? And Michael is going to present the best arguments for the theist. And Michael, just tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, my name is Michael Jones. I run Inspiring Philosophy. It's a YouTube channel, and we are creating a video library to answer every apologetic question out there to defend Christianity.
Sweet. So how long have you been in the industry?
I've been doing the channel since beginning of 2012, I believe. So it's been almost a decade now.
Okay. Well, and before we start, what do you think is your best argument or your best video? Your best video?
Oh, that's a good question. Maybe my video, The Emergent Universe, which is a presentation of one of my favorite arguments for God's existence. So that's not what we're going to be going over here today, because that's a little bit more complicated, but these are just some of the basic arguments. These are the three most used arguments.
Okay, well, you can take the floor now.
Okay, and really, let me get my screen ready here. All right, let me know if you see that, and then we can get going.
Okay, still waiting. So.
Okay, here we go.
There you go. Okay.
All right. So these are three arguments for God's existence. So I was basically asked today to give a general introduction to arguments for theism. If this is your first time hearing arguments for God's existence, this will be a good introduction. If you've been an apologetic for years, this will be pretty much repeating a lot of stuff you may have already heard. But for those who've not really been into apologetics, who don't know that much about it, this is a good place to start and get an idea for the evidence for God's existence. So I'll present the three most used arguments throughout history. I won't have time to cover every objection to these arguments. I'm just going to present the basic arguments you get at sort of a layman level, and then we'll cover some interesting evidence to support them. So the first argument that has been used mostly to support God's existence is called the cosmological argument. A very simple form is the Kalam form of it, which is simply that premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, when it comes to the first premise, there are some objections you'll get to it in a little bit more advanced discussions about this, but for the most part, it seems to be pretty intuitively obvious. If something is going to begin to exist, there has to be cause. Things don't just pop into existence from nothing without a cause. So this one just seems to basically flow. So the real question is did the universe begin to exist? About 100 years ago, a lot of scientists said no, the universe did not begin to exist. If we go back and look at the history of modern cosmology, back during the days of Einstein, most physicists, scientists in general, believed the universe was eternal. It had no beginning. It just has always existed. And this was an idea we saw back from Aristotle. However, in around 1922, 1927, around those times, a couple of physicists started working with Einstein's equations, and they argued that space-time, which is just another word for the universe, was expanding out. Now, if something is expanding out, if you go back in time, it has to get smaller, get smaller, and get smaller, until you go back in time far enough that it just comes in, it just is so small that the physical equations of the universe break down. So they argued this implied an absolute beginning point. In 1929, Edwin Hubble discovered that light from distant galaxies was shifting towards the red spectrum. And this demonstrated that light was getting further away from us, not closer. Now, when these discoveries happened, it basically upset the scientific community, because they were under the impression the universe was eternal. The idea that there was a beginning point was absurd to them. In fact, in 1959, 2/3 of all astronomers and physicists rejected that the universe had a beginning. In 1965, some astronomers discovered that the cosmic microwave background radiation. And what this proved was that there was a big bang in this cosmic microwave background radiation was the afterglow from the quote unquote initial explosion, so to speak, of the universe coming into existence. And so this supported the Big Bang. And then after this discovery, most scientists had to accept the universe had an absolute beginning point. In fact, Alexander Vilenkin said, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." So it's pretty much accepted now that the universe began to exist. But if what begins to exist has a cause and the universe began to exist, this implies the universe had a cause. Now, at this point, a lot of atheists will be like, so what? That doesn't mean it was God. But we have to start to think about what the cause of the universe was. If all of space and all of time came into existence when the universe began to exist, then what caused the universe would have to be spaceless and timeless. Some would say, well, it may have come from nothing. But that's absurd. Nothing cannot produce something. It has to come from something. Just a spaceless, timeless something. Well, maybe it came from something that is eternal. Maybe it's just some eternal substance that's not conscious or sentient. It's just there's this other larger, perhaps, realm out there that somehow created our universe. We need to stop and think about that for a second. How does something that's non-conscious create something else? If you want a rock to roll down a hill, how do you get the rock to roll down the hill on its own? Well, you can't. It has to be caused by something else. Things that are not conscious have to cause other things. Now think about what caused the universe. If it is spaceless and timeless, it cannot be acted upon by some other physical object because there's no space there. There's no time for events to play out to cause something. So it's very unlikely that somehow a non-conscious substance could cause it. We're talking about the very first cause as well. What gave rise to everything else? In reality, the only thing that can somehow cause itself to act would be a conscious being. So the most likely explanation is that it came from an eternal being. So just to sum up, if the universe has a cause, it has to be spaceless, it has to be timeless because all of space and time are within the universe, as far as we're aware. It has to somehow be acted upon not by some other object, because then that would just ask, well, what acted upon that other object? And we just push the question further back. So we're asking, what was the first cause? What created everything? Well, there's nothing to act upon it because it's the first cause. It somehow had to move of itself to somehow create the universe. And the only thing that moves in and of itself would be a conscious being. And of course, it would have to be eternal because there's no time there as well. So the most likely explanation is that it was a conscious being that caused the universe. So let's move on to the second argument. And again, these are very brief summaries of the arguments. There are other objections to these I'm not going to get to because I don't want to overload anyone today if this is your first time hearing these. Another argument is known as the teleological argument, and this is about design and nature. It basically runs as this. The fine-tuning of the universe is either due to design or chance, or physical necessity. Premise 2, it's not due to chance or physical necessity. Conclusion, therefore the fine-tuning of the universe is due to design. So, let's talk about what fine-tuning is. Basically, the fine-tuning of the universe is when the laws of physics and the initial conditions of the Big Bang must be such as to make our existence possible. If you think about it, the best way to explain it is with examples. So in nature, the strong nuclear force that binds protons and neutrons together, if this force was smaller by 1 part in 1,000, nothing beyond hydrogen would form. If it was larger by 1 part in 1,000, no atomic nuclei would form. There's another force in nature known as the weak nuclear force, and it's responsible for the way that particles decay over time. If it was slightly higher, no supernovas would exist, and therefore no chemicals would exist past iron. Therefore, life would not exist because we need many more chemicals other than iron, anything bigger than iron. If it was slightly smaller, the universe would have converted all of its hydrogen into helium, and there would be no water, no life, because there's no hydrogen for burning stars. If the neutron was not 1.00 times the mass of the proton, all protons would have decayed into neutrons. And if it was slightly higher, all neutrons would have decayed into protons. So this is what the fine-tuning of the universe is. It's that the physical forces that are necessary for life are basically balanced on a razor's edge. If they were slightly smaller or slightly larger, there would be no life. It's extremely improbable, given what we know with physics, for life to exist within the universe. The laws of the universe have to be balanced or fine-tuned to such a small degree to get the complexity that is necessary for life. Some other bigger examples are like the nuclear resonance of stars. It has to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 100. The critical density of the universe has to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 15th power. The curvature of space at the Big Bang, the ratio of electromagnetic force to gravity, and the cosmological constant. The cosmological constant is what is causing the universe to expand out. And it has to be fine-tuned to such a extremely high degree. If it was just 1 part in 10 to the 120th power faster, nothing would form. The universe would be expanding too fast for anything beyond hydrogen to form. If it was smaller than 1 part in 10 to 120th power, the gravity would cause the universe to collapse back in on itself, and yet you'd get no life. So the universe is fine-tuned on a razor's edge. And you need all these constants need to be put together in a very precise way to get the complexity that we see in stars to create the elements we need for life. So how did this come about? How did we get these incredibly odd universe to actually get life? Well, some argue that it was physically necessary, that the universe had to be this way. Well, Stephen Hawking points out that's probably unlikely. He says, even when we understand the ultimate theory, it won't tell us much about how the universe began. It cannot predict the dimensions of space, the gauge groups, or other parameters of the low-energy effective theory. It won't determine how this energy is divided between conventional matter and the cosmological constant. So to come back to the question, does string theory predict the state of the universe? The answer is that it does not. It allows a vast landscape of possible universes in which we occupy an anthropically permitted location. So basically, he's just saying we're lucky. There's no way that the universe had to be balanced on this razor's edge as we have it now. Well, maybe it's just chance, as some physicists like Hawking's would argue. Well, that's possible. Maybe we are just lucky. We just happen to get into the right universe. A lot of physicists posit that there's a multiverse. Outside of our universe, so to speak, there are billions, trillions, and trillions upon other universes. And many of them don't contain life. We're just lucky enough to be in the one that does have life. So we're just lucky. However, philosophers have addressed this. First of all, there's no formal theory of how the multiverse would work. There's no way to explain it right now, currently, with our modern physics in terms of mathematics and whatnot. We also need to note that the initial conditions of the multiverse would need to be fine-tuned. This is something the philosopher Robin Collins has pointed out. You need some sort of universe generator that keeps creating variety to eventually get to the point where you get a universe that is fine-tuned for life. So that if the multiverse does exist, and there's very little evidence that suggests that it does, it would need to be fine-tuned to get constant variety, so you eventually get a universe that produces life. And most importantly, it adds too many assumptions. Richard Swinburne says, "It is the height of irrationality to postulate an infinite number of universes, never causally connected with each other, merely to avoid the hypothesis of theism. Given that simplicity makes for prior probability, and a theory is simpler the fewer entities it postulates, it's far simpler to posit one God than an infinite number of universes, each differing from each other in accord with a regular formula, uncaused by anything else." So he's just simply pointing out that given what we know about just logical necessity, about simplicity, it's far more likely that there is simply one designer than an infinite number of universes, this highly complex multiverse that has an exorbitant amount of variety. Alvin Plantinga also sort of explains this with an analogy. So Alvin Plantinga presents an analogy of like a poker game. He says, imagine you're sitting at a poker table, and one person at the table keeps dealing aces. It's been about 5 or 6 hands every time he deals aces. You keep going, about to the 10th time, everyone gets up the table and ready to punch him. He goes, well, hold on, guys. I know it looks suspicious, but suppose there's an infinite number of universes. And then in these infinite number of universes, there's an infinite number of poker games. And we just happen to be in the one universe where I keep constantly getting 4 aces. So Plantinga says, possibly there's an infinite succession of universes, so that for any possible distribution of possible poker hands, there's a universe in which that possibility is realized. And we just happen to find ourselves where someone like me always deals himself aces and wild cards without ever cheating.
Wow.
Now, you got to think, do you think that's a likely scenario, or do you think it's more likely he is cheating by design? Well, everyone in their right mind would say it's far more likely he's cheating by design. And this is what philosophers like Robin Collins, Richard Swinburne, and Alvin Plantinga point out. It's far more likely that the universe is due to design, the fine-tuning of it, than it just being here by chance. Given how infinitely rare a finely tuned universe would be, it's far more likely that it was here because of design, not chance. And of course, there's nothing in the laws of physics that suggests it's due to physical necessity. Therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to design. So that's the second argument for God's existence. The third argument for God's existence is called the moral argument. If God does not exist, objective morals do not exist. Premise 2, objective morals do exist. Premise 3, therefore God exists. Now, maybe in past decades, we could just accept the second premise as obvious. But today, a lot of atheists don't think objective morals exist, surprisingly. I'm shocked by that, but a lot do not. So we need to actually argue for the second premise as well as the first premise. So I'll start by defending the second premise, and then we'll defend the first premise. So Andrew Fisher says moral realism holds that moral judgments can be true or false, that sometimes they are true, and that what makes them true is independent from people's or groups of people's beliefs, judgments, or desires. In a nutshell, Fisher says that objective moral values and duties, that means basically that they are true independent of what any person thinks today. So, is there evidence for this position? Doesn't morality differ from culture to culture? If you go to Africa, they're going to have different morals, as we're told. If you go to China, they're going to have different morals. Well, that can be challenged the more you study these cultures, because cultures exhibit widespread agreement regarding basic values. So some might point to Inuit tribes that believe that it's okay, that believe that they ought to abandon their elders when they get old enough. But they don't actually think it's good to abandon family members. What they actually believe is that if you die too old, you won't be able to be too old and frail in the afterlife, and you won't be able to survive there. So they abandon their elders and have them die younger, so that they're more fit in the afterlife. Some African tribes kill deformed babies, but they don't think they're actually killing humans. They think they're demons, and they're getting rid of them. Cultures actually agree on values. The reason why they display different morals is because they have different underlying truths. They think that they're actually killing demons. And so the way you correct a lot of moral disagreement in other cultures is not to change their morals. You change their facts about reality. You tell them things like, well, no, these deformed babies are not demons. They're actually humans. Don't kill them. Once you convince them they're human, they don't kill them. So you don't have to change their morals per se. You change their underlying facts that's making them do certain things. The other problem with saying that morality differs from culture to culture is, where do cultures exist? Do they exist at the family, the community, the city, state, or nation? And who objectively decides where cultural morals start? What if a man in culture A, like let's say America, has relations with a woman in culture B, let's say in Africa, but they're living in China? whose moral laws do they hold to? We also have to think about the reformer's dilemma. If morals are decided by the culture, is Martin Luther King Jr. a heretic or someone who's evil because he went against the culture of the South and tried to change things? Arguing that morals are defined by culture is filled with a lot of problems. So Tim Keller makes this a very good argument. He says, is there anyone in the world right now doing things you believe they should stop doing, no matter what they personally believe about the correctness of their behavior? They would invariably say, yes, of course. Then I would ask, doesn't that mean that you believe there is some kind of moral reality that is there, that is not defined by us, that must be abided by, regardless of what a person thinks? So if you think that things in Africa, like female mutilation, are horrible and need to stop, regardless if the person in that culture thinks it's okay, then you would say that person must abide by some moral law outside of them, and they should follow it regardless of what they currently think. Well, that implies you think that morals are objective, not something just decided by the culture, something we would compare maybe to like taste preferences. We don't think taste preferences are objective. It's okay to have different taste preferences, and we think that's fine. Moral values and duties don't appear to be like that. Well, isn't right and wrong just grounded in well-being? Shouldn't we just say that, you should just encourage well-being and that's all we need to do? We don't have to look for a God or some sort of moral law outside of nature. We just have to encourage well-being. All humans want to do that. Well, this is something that we would call an is-ought fallacy. It's basically in a nutshell. You cannot look at things in nature the way things are and derive oughts from the way things are. So think about it. If well-being just means good, they basically mean the same thing. Then you're saying we ought to increase well-being because well-being is well-being and we want to encourage well-being. It doesn't really make any sense. Why should we encourage well-being? Because it's good. Well, what defines it as good? You can't say the physical or the natural state of well-being is equated or the same thing as good. We define the state of well-being as good. Same with pain. If pain means bad, then we ought to decrease pain because pain is pain. We want to have less pain. It doesn't really make sense. In a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is there's a difference between the physical descriptions and moral prescriptions. So if I could describe to you someone killing someone else with a knife, I could describe the motion of the hand, the knife coming down, hitting the skin, piercing the skin. I could describe to all of you in the mathematics, the angle, the physics of it all. Nowhere in me describing physically what is happening do you find a moral prescription that person should not be doing that. I'm basically saying outside of the physical description, we're imposing, so to speak, that there's a moral ought that they should not be doing that. You can't really ground right and wrong in well-being because we are describing well-being as right or wrong. So it's imposed on the physical. So how do we know objective morals exist? Well, philosophers will note that it's basically intuitive that this is the case. Richard Boyd says, in the sciences we decide between theories on the basis of observations. We have an important degree of objectivity. It appears that in moral reasoning, moral intuitions play the same role which observations do in science. We test general moral principles and moral theories by seeing how their consequences form or fail to conform to our moral intuitions about particular cases. Kai Nelson says it's more reasonable to believe such elemental things as wife beating and child abuse to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or reasonably believe any of those things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his moral beliefs. So in a nutshell, we know moral values and duties are objective because it's intuitive. It's just the way, it's the standard practice. We know that they're objective for the same reason. We know that science is objective. Science is objective regardless of what anyone thinks. Just because someone might think the earth is flat, that doesn't mean science is subjective. Likewise, just because someone might have different morals, that doesn't mean moral values are subjective. So the burden is on the skeptic to show that moral values and duties are subjective. It's not on us. So we can see that objective the second premise is intuitively obvious, and the skeptic has not met the burden to show that this is false. Again, the burden is actually on them, not on the moral realist. So what about the first premise? If God does not exist, objective morals do not exist. Why do we need to ground objective morals in a God? How do we get there? Well, let's think about what objective morals actually are. Well, what do they actually are? Well, they're moral prescriptions, and they entail a prescriber. So Francis J. Beckworth and Greg Kokel note, a command only makes sense when there is two minds involved, one giving the command and one receiving it. So think about that. I could command you to watch over my family. I could prescribe to you that. That entails two minds. Now, there are objective prescriptions, objective oughts we have to abide by. That entails there's some sort of mind that has objectively prescribed them to us. So basically, moral prescriptions and ought entail there is a prescriber. They're beyond the natural realm. You can't ground them in well-being or pain or anything natural. Value doesn't exist in non-conscious things. Rocks, we would say do not have moral value. They only make sense in terms of conscious beings. So they have to come from a conscious being. They have to be powerful enough to create our consciousness and our value, and actually care enough to give us moral value. And this must be unchanging and timeless to affirm objective values. So basically, this entails that it is a objective mind that objective moral values and duties are grounded in. So basically, this argument also supports the idea that God exists. And with that, those are the three basic arguments for God's existence. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Now, real quick, though, I just want to say there's a lot of objections. I understand to a lot of these I don't have time to get to. This is a basic summary of the basic arguments. And I apologize, I did have some spelling errors in there, but those are the three basic arguments.
Yeah, sure. We'll start taking questions from the comment section. So if you have your question, just type it in there. And we have the first one from CJ. He says, hello, I have a question. I'm talking to an atheist, and they say that God cannot be timeless because timeless things cannot do anything, because for anything to happen, time must exist. How should I respond?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the one thing we need to say is that there are different forms of causations. The philosopher Alexander Pruss has written extensively on this. He's got a whole book on causality. So what we need to point out is that he says there are three kinds of causation. There's event causation, agent causation, and conceptual causation. Now, event causation does require time. You have to an event to play out, you have to have time. The other two forms of causation, agent causation and conceptual causation, don't necessarily need time. Conceptual causation doesn't even need time. Conceptual causation is basically 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 causes 4. It's a concept, basically. Now, that is a timeless truth. That does not require time. Agent causation can require time, but it doesn't necessarily. So what philosophers argue is that God would simply actualize in his timeless state all of his actions at once from a timeless instance. So he doesn't experience progression of time. Now, William Lane Craig also responds to that. His is a little bit different. He says the moment God created the universe, he became as sort of like a part of time. So he is eternally there, but the moment at the Big Bang, God sort of enters into time, and therefore he is causing things within time. Either of those solutions work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that God could not exist, because God would simply either actualize all of his actions at once, or the moment he creates time, now he is having time unfold as well, and he is causing things within time. Either of those are fine.
Okay. We have another question right here. What should you say to these atheists or these who argue that evolution disproves creationism?
Well, it does. We have to be careful what we mean by creationism. If we mean young Earth creationism, yeah, evolution would definitely disprove it if it's true. Now, I'm a theistic evolutionist. I don't think evolution disproves God's existence, and I don't think a lot of evolutionists say that. It's a very weird thing to say. It would disprove young Earth creationism, But there are other ways. There are other ways to understand biblical texts out there. If you want to go onto my channel, Inspiring Philosophy, I have a series on Genesis 1 to 11. I will have part 9 out in a week, or Genesis 9 out in a week from today. But I go through the first chapters of Genesis and I explain how they're compatible with the theory of evolution. So yeah, it would disprove young Earth creationism, but that doesn't necessarily mean it would disprove theism, let alone Christianity. It would just disprove this one view on Genesis that you don't have to hold to.
Yeah, actually, we were talking about this before the live stream, and actually, after watching your videos, I decided to embrace the idea of evolution because the evidence is so strong, and the way you explain in your videos makes sense from a Christian worldview too.
Yeah, and if you want to check out, I gave a TED talk called "Could There Be Design in Evolution?" and I basically presented a theory of evolution that's compatible with a theistic worldview. So evolution people tend to think of evolution as this chaotic process that is unguided, but there are guided theories of evolution.
Yeah, actually, Saint Augustine was the one that proposed something like this in the 5th century, when he said that maybe just God planted a seed, and everything came from that, and he let the process go. So yeah, evolution doesn't disprove Christianity. I mean, it can disprove the young Earth creationists, but not a Christian worldview.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it does not disprove that at all.
So, question: what would you say to those who argue in favor of the infinite loop model of the universe?
So those models, depends on what they mean by infinite loop. If they mean the big expansion, big crunch, big expansion, big crunch model, those don't get you to an eternal universe, because what we know from the physics of the universe right now is the universe is expanding. And not only is it expanding, it's increasing in speed as it expands. So there is no known physics to reverse that and cause a big crunch. It's purely hypothetical. And also based on the entropy in the current universe, if there was a big expansion crunch, basically the universe could have only expanded and crunched about 80 times prior to this, even if that theory is true. So you still get to an absolute beginning. It just happened 80 expansions, crunches ago. But it's very speculative because the physics shows the universe is expanding and increasing in speed, and there's no known physics that's ever going to reverse that and cause us to crunch back down. So it's very, very unlikely.
Yeah, and even the Borth-Goodwin-Lincoln theorem says that even if a multiverse is proven to be true, then it still needs a beginning.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. There are no infinite loop models that are coherent right now. There are some that are hypothetical, but they are not really. They're not really entertained as much in physics these days because what we know currently about the universe.
Yeah. So if you still have a question, please feel free to ask. We're going to be here for 10 more minutes if there are no questions. What argument will you give against a multiverse?
Well, some of the stuff I presented in there, for one, there's not a lot of evidence necessarily for it. And again, even if the multiverse does exist, it doesn't mean it's going to be the multiverse that we need to generate this infinite possibility of universes. What if there's a multiverse and every universe is fine-tuned this way specifically? Okay, that's going to be even more of a conundrum for the skeptic, because now they have to explain why there are multiple finely tuned universes. So it's going to be extremely difficult to prove, let alone even find evidence for. So that's what I would basically argue. And again, I would go back to what I gave in the presentation, that it just is ad hoc. It's only really posited to avoid design. I mean, Leonard Susskind basically said that in an interview on an old show called What We Still Don't Know, that we're basically positing the multiverse so we can avoid design. I'm paraphrasing him, but it's basically just absurd at this point. Even if you do find it, it still gets you to fine tuning, as Robin Collins points out. So there's no reason to posit it at this point.
Okay, well, if you have any questions left, then please ask it in the comment section. Do you believe in macroevolution or simply microevolution, such as natural selection?
No, I believe in macroevolution. I believe in all of evolution. And so you can see my TED Talk on this, where I basically explain that evolution is perfectly compatible with theism.
Yes. So if you really want to know about evolution in Michael's view, then go check his channel. He has a whole playlist on Genesis 1, and he already talked about it. And that actually helped me a lot because that's one of the arguments that atheists present when you engage with them. So they're going to tell you, well, you believe that the earth was, or the universe was created in 7 days. So Michael has great content on it. And actually, you are the only one, the only channel that has deep information on this. So
Thanks, I appreciate that.
can you please expound for us the Holy Trinity? Thank you.
The Holy Trinity?
Yeah, the Holy Trinity.
I mean, the Holy Trinity is summed up in 3 sentences. There is one God. God is 3 persons. Each person is fully God. So the Father is not the Son is not the Holy Spirit is not the Father. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. There are 3, and these 3 are one. Now that's logically hard to fathom, but a lot of atheists like to straw man it and pretend it's modalism, that it's just God taking different forms, but that's not it at all. There is one God. God is 3 distinct persons, and each person is fully God.
Yeah. Also, Michael has a playlist on this, so go check it out, please. How you respond to someone saying that fine-tuning argument is a God of the gaps argument?
So yeah, let's talk about what God of the gaps even means. I hate this argument from atheists. If anyone says that's a God of the gaps argument, honestly, they don't want to think. That's just honestly, the more I hear this argument, they don't want to think about the argument. They're just looking for anything they can to throw out there and say, to just dismiss it outright. A God of the gaps argument is basically revealing that the atheist is committing circular reasoning. What do I mean by that? Well, they're assuming the conclusion of naturalism or an atheistic worldview is already true. And so what they're saying is any evidence that points to a God can't really point to God because we already know an atheistic worldview is true. So any evidence that points there is probably just a gap in our knowledge. And how do we know it's a gap in our knowledge? Well, because we already know naturalism or an atheistic worldview is true. It's just circular reasoning. They're assuming the conclusion they want, and they're assuming any evidence that points to a God must really just be a gap in our knowledge. Imagine if we did this with other things. Imagine a flat earther saying, well, no, there's no such thing as gravity. You're just looking at things out there, and you're filling this thing called, he's filling these unknown explanations with gravity. We don't know what's causing things to fall to the earth, but you just made up this gravity concept and filled all the gaps in our knowledge with it. That would sound silly, but it's okay when it comes to God. It doesn't make any sense. What we really do is we look at the evidence, we make a theory that best explains that data, and then we put it out there. It would be absurd for young earth creationists to do this with evolution, for them to say, oh, all that evidence you think points to evolution, you just found a bunch of fossils and you just filled in the gap to explain these fossils with your theory of evolution. No, we would argue that the evidence most likely points to evolution given the data. Likewise, the evidence in fine-tuning, the beginning of the universe, and objective moral values and duties most likely points to a theistic worldview. We've presented a theory that explains the data. They just can't assume an atheistic worldview or a naturalistic worldview and then assume that all this data that points to theism are just gaps in our knowledge, because all they're pointing out, they're just assuming the conclusion they want. So it's just circular reasoning. There's no reason to posit that. It's a pretty bad argument. And really, they don't want to think. They're just looking for a quick, snappy comeback to dismiss any evidence. But what they're really revealing is they're just committing circular reasoning.
Yeah, and I actually was watching a debate between Dawkins and Professor Lennox, and he said that there are certain gaps that science closes, but there are other gaps that science opens. So that's something to point out.
Yeah, well, I mean, quantum physics, when we discovered that, it opened all sorts of new pathways to study and new gaps in our knowledge. That doesn't mean that we should not posit it. I mean, science is always trying to expand our knowledge and whatnot. We should always be trying to expand our knowledge. And then there's all these unexplained phenomenons, and physicists offer different theories. Like maybe there's brain cosmology, maybe there's a multiverse theory. When it comes to quantum physics, they'll posit different interpretations of quantum physics. It'd be absurd to dismiss one interpretation of quantum mechanics by saying, well, you're just filling gaps in our knowledge with your interpretation. Well, that'd be silly. That's a bad argument. And it's just as bad when it comes to the arguments for theism.
Yeah. What we try to do is present the evidence and come to a conclusion to what's the most logical explanation to everything. Okay. There's another question also. Do you 100% think that there's suffering in heaven? And I think this is a reference to one of your videos or to one of your debates with Cosmic Skeptic, right?
Yeah, so let's talk about what we mean by suffering. When people hear that, they immediately think, torture, gratuitous suffering. I don't think there's gratuitous suffering in heaven. I don't think that there is it's like a hell-like environment. That's a straw man of my position that some atheists were doing. No, what I mean by suffering, I'm talking about broadly speaking. You could experience very, very slight suffering in solving a problem. You could experience slight suffering in dealing with a challenge. I think what I would say is that the final goal of heaven is the resurrection here on earth. So we're going to return to our physical bodies. That might mean we're probably still going to be eating food, which means we could feel hunger. Now, when you feel hunger, you feel minimal amounts of suffering. I suggest that maybe in the resurrection, we may still need to sleep. Or when you feel tired, you feel minimal amounts of suffering. I'm not arguing there's going to be torture, death, destruction, all these types of things. I'm just saying there is the way human conscious beings are, is that if you're going to deal with challenges or just progressing through events, you can experiencing minimal amounts of that. It is not to say that it's going to be like hell or it's going to just be like here on earth. It's just talking about in a very broad definition of suffering. Yeah,
because I think that maybe if you trip in heaven, then it's going to hurt because you're going to have to.
I mean, I don't think it's going to be like this caricature version where it's just no one ever experiences any challenges. No one ever has to expand their mind. A big theme in Christian theology is that we're going to spend eternity exploring the mind of God. Well, if we're going to be constantly learning new things about God, learning things sometimes requires challenge. Challenge has minimal amounts of suffering to overcome. That just seems like it logically follows. That doesn't mean we're going to be suffering in the colloquial sense. It just means there is suffering in the broad sense of it, just exploring new challenges.
Okay, well, what's the difference between our God and Allah?
Well, the difference is that there is no evidence that really supports Islam, and when it comes to Christianity, we have the resurrection argument. The difference is that Islam is founded on the idea that Muhammad had private visions. We just have to go on his word. Christianity, Jesus was crucified publicly. He was buried in a public tomb. The people knew the location, and he rose and appeared to many people publicly. It's built on a public proclamation, and we can study the evidence for that. It's hard to do that, which is private visions by someone.
Yeah, something else to point out is that in the Quran, Allah has no sons, but in Deuteronomy, Moses calls Israel the sons of God, and also the angels are sometimes called the sons of God. So even if a Muslim tries to say that they worship the God found in the Torah, that's not accurate, because there are different views of God, and also the Trinity is another big challenge or another big objections that Muslims bring, that Allah or God is only one, and how can he be three? And that's pluralism of gods and weird stuff. This might be a silly question, but why do you think God only made or why do you think God only make Earth compatible for life?
Well, I don't think that. I think there are multiple planets that could be compatible with life. So given the amount of planets out there, there's probably several that life could exist on. Now, maybe there's only life currently on this planet. That's possible. But even if that's the case, remember, the end goal of Christianity is the resurrection here in this universe, on this earth. we're probably not going to spend eternity on this earth, given with the big universe. We have, if we're going to be immortal, we'll probably be able to explore the rest of the universe and expand out and create life on other planets. Not like, magically. I think we could bring other animals there and allow them to prosper and grow on those worlds. So no, I think maybe that it's possible that there is life on other planets. And that's not the case. I think in the resurrection, we'll be able to explore the rest of the universe and see it all for ourselves and spread life across the universe. My specific goal when it comes to eschatology is that in the resurrection, it's going to be our job to turn the universe into Eden.
Yeah, because you argue that Eden is the first temple, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, can you sin in heaven?
Of course. I would say so.
So do you think it will be possible? Well, I mean, do you think it will actually happen?
To sing in heaven?
To sin, not to sing.
Oh, sin. I thought you said sing.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sin.
I think it's possible, but I think it's unlikely for the same reason now. You're not putting any quarters in your mouth, even though when you were a toddler, you may have done that. I know I probably did it when I was a toddler. Well, why don't I do it now? Am I free to? Well, of course I'm free to, but I'm just not stupid.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. What part does faith play in your belief system? Do you need tangible proof in order to believe?
Do I need tangible proof? I'm not sure what that means, but no, I think you need to have enough evidence to believe. So I think there's enough evidence to support the reliability of the Bible, specifically the Gospels and the New Testament. And I think there's enough evidence to support the resurrection case. So that's enough evidence to convince me that Christianity is true. So I don't know if I need what tangible would mean, but no, I think there's enough evidence in the resurrection alone to convince me that it happened.
Yeah, and this is how I see it. We have all the evidence here, but you still have to fill that gap with your faith, and that's when saving faith comes and plays a huge role. You decide to commit your life to Jesus. So I think that faith goes hand by hand with evidence, because if God is real, then we're going to see him in science and philosophy and all this stuff, but at the same time we need to exercise our faith in him.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right.
What is your view on hell?
What is my view on hell? I did a video called "Does God Send People to Hell?" And so that would be my view on hell right there. It would be basically that hell is a place where people send themselves. The doors of hell are locked from the inside. And so it's like an outer darkness place.
Okay. How can you be 100% of miracles? How can you be 100% sure that miracles exist or occur?
Well, I can't be 100% sure, but I think they're likely to have occurred in the past, given enough evidence for some of them to exist. Craig Keener's got a whole book, a giant volume on miracles. You may doubt some of them, but he's got some pretty good evidence for some other ones in there as well.
Okay. If we can't sin in heaven, does that mean that we have no free will?
Well, no, I think, as I said earlier, I think we will have the possibility to, but we'll just have gotten to the point where it just would be like eating quarters. You're not going to do that now, even though you have the freedom to right now, but you don't do it now. You still have the free will to do it, but you're just smart enough to know that's a bad idea. Likewise, in heaven, we'll be smart enough to know that sin is just so bad for us, we won't do it.
Okay. Have you read Graham Opie and other atheist philosophers who argue that naturalism is simpler and has better explanatory power for theism? Well, read Alvin Plantinga's argument against naturalism.
Yeah, and you also have to remember naturalism. One of my chief problems with naturalism is it doesn't explain a lot. It doesn't explain fine-tuning. It doesn't explain why the universe began to exist. It doesn't explain objective moral values and duties. It doesn't explain consciousness. That's a huge problem for naturalism. It's filled with so many holes. They call them gaps. Ironically, when they point out that there are gaps, they're just pointing out their worldview is filled with holes in it. So it can't explain anything. And also, the naturalistic worldview comes up with a different explanation for consciousness, or the beginning of the universe, or fine-tuning, or moral values and duties. They posit all these different explanations, whereas theism can explain all of that with one explanation. So by definition, it is simpler.
Yeah. Well, then what will happen if someone sin in heaven?
I don't know. I'm not there.
So what you argue is that it is possible to happen, but it won't happen.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Oops. I don't think people will sin in heaven. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to. Do you accept mother exorcism as being legitimate, happening frequently?
Do I think exorcism?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I need to study that a little bit more. As of now, I've not looked into it that much.
Well, I don't know if you can answer this question. What issues do you have with Pentecostalism and charismatics?
Nothing. They're Christians.
Yeah, yeah.
I just don't consider myself one.
Yeah, I think we worship God in a different way. I think they're more excited to do it, and other people just try to relax and worship God in a different way because we are wired differently. And I think that God wants our heart and not our actions and how much we can sing and jump. Um, why will God give us a sinful nature and blame us for being sinful?
Why? Could you repeat that question?
Why will God give us a sinful nation and um, and blame us for being sinful?
Oh, sinful nature?
Yeah.
Okay, so C.S. Lewis responded to this and said, God didn't give us a sinful nature. He gave us selves. You are a self, I'm a self, everyone is a self. And he says the moment you have a self, there is the possibility of putting that self before anyone else. And this was the sin that Adam and Eve were taught, how to just be selfish. So the very nature of just creating unique minds entails that a unique mind could put themselves before anyone else and just become selfish and prideful. So it's not so much that we're given a sinful nature, it's that just simply is a logical necessity of creating minds.
Yeah, and you argue for that in your videos too, so
Right.
check it out. So I saw an atheist say in here that just because God might be the most logical explanation, it doesn't make him real. Thoughts?
Sure. I mean, but it's not a question of possibility, it's a question of probability. Yeah, it doesn't mean God necessarily exists, but when we present these arguments, we're making a probabilistic case that God explains far more with far less. It's the most likely explanation given this data, and therefore theism is most likely true. I personally have never been an atheist, even when I wasn't a Christian for a short time. I just never made sense to me that there was not at least some deistic God behind the universe. And so yeah, it's possible this could all be explained another way, but given the current data, given the current evidence, it's far more likely theism is true.
Yeah. We love Michael Jones. Mike Jones.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
What do you think is more important in Christian faith, head knowledge, and logic, or loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength?
Say that again.
What do you think is more important in the Christian faith, head knowledge and logic, or loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength?
Well, obviously, loving God is more important in the Christian faith. But we also need to recognize that I don't think those two are necessarily divorced from each other. We obviously have to have knowledge of God in order to love him. I don't think it's an either or type of thing. I think they both are, they're blurred as almost the same thing in certain instances. So I wouldn't really divorce them in that way.
Yeah, and I also think that it is part of the commandments in the Bible. Be prepared to give a response for your faith and for your hope that you have. So I think that God wants both of them because we cannot love a God that we don't know. And in my personal case, the more I learned about apologetics, the more I love God, and the more I see how big and wonderful He is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So is that the last question? Or?
I think so. If anyone has a final question, then we will have 2 more minutes here, and then that'll be it. Is original sin true? Is sin passed down through humanity, and is age of accountability biblical?
Yeah, I think the original sin is true. Now, I take the Orthodox Church view on original sin, not the St. Augustine view. St. Augustine would say that everyone is born guilty because of Adam, and I would say that everyone is born with Adam's sinful nature. So it's not so much that we're guilty because of our own sin when we come into the age of accountability. It's not that we are born guilty.
So, do you think age of accountability is biblical?
Yeah. Yeah, I did. If you see my video on Genesis 7, I argue that it is.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to end the live here. Thank you guys for joining. Thank you, Michael Jones, for being here with me. It's a pleasure to be sharing the screen with you. You are one of my favorite apologists online, and thank you for your work and for everything you do, man. Well, thank you so much. Bye-bye, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me.